I think you probably have to log into things at work if you're watching this video. And you also have to go through some annoying ways to do so. In this video, we'll go over ways that you can log into systems to help you be secure, including one that I'm hoping will catch on in the future to make your login experience less annoying. This, in my opinion, is one of the most important videos of this course. Adopting some of the practices described in this video can help you stay safer. You're probably familiar with the system of logging in where you type in your username and then your password, which is something you know. However, in order for your account to be even more secure, it can be good to have a second part of the authentication process. The reason this can be useful is that if a bad hacker either guesses your password using a computer to try a bunch of passwords until it guesses yours, or your password is leaked and someone gets the password that way, your account would also need a second way if you've enabled it in order to get access, which may be harder for the bad hacker to get. A practice for having a second factor of authentication is to mix and match something you know, like your password, something you have, like a USB key, or something you are, like your fingerprint. So, when I introduce these ways that you could potentially log into a system, I'll introduce the ways to log in with which of the options that are matched. To log into some websites, if you have a smartphone, you may be asked to use something called an authenticator application. There are at least a couple of ways to use the authenticator application on your smartphone, which is something you have, with the password, which is something you know. When logging into a website, the authentication application may have a temporary number for the website you're trying to log into. If a bad hacker doesn't have access to your authenticator application, it can be difficult for a bad hacker to guess those numbers before the time period is done. Another way you can log into a website may be to use a fingerprint scanner paired with a password. You can use something called a password manager to store different passwords for each website that requires one, which I highly recommend doing. In order to access the passwords, you can set up the password manager to use a physical device such as a fingerprint scanner to be required to access the password. So the password, which in spirit is something you know, even though technically it's the password manager that knows it, and the fingerprint scanner uses something you are, which in this case is represented by a fingerprint as the second form of authentication. There are some keyboards that have a fingerprint scanner built in for a purpose like this. Before I continue, I want to stress how much I recommend that you use a password manager and learn to use one for as long as you'll be using passwords. If you keep using the same password for websites, or you use passwords that are short or could be easily guessed, then your account may be easier to get into. However, with password managers, the passwords that the password manager makes can be a lot longer and harder to guess than what a lot of people may be able to make for a password. Additionally, you can have a different password for each website rather than one or a small number of passwords for websites. Out of all of the things in this course, you adopting the use of a password manager, I believe, is one of the most important. The password manager that I use has a browser extension that I've found useful. So I've been able to go between Windows, Mac OS, and Linux systems and still be able to use the same password manager. When you're making passwords, which is something you know and which you'll need for a password manager, consider the following. You could use a password, but using a passphrase may be better. For example, consider having some phrase like "I like barbecue" and surround that phrase with some special characters and have a number somewhere in there. So you could have a passphrase such as "I like barbecue 1, If you're allowed to use commas for your passwords, it could be fun to do so because sometimes leaked password lists are put into CSV, which stands for comma separated values files. If you have a comma in your password, then the list may possibly have a little bit of trouble listing your password correctly, which could make it slightly harder for some automated systems to put your password into a website. It's unlikely that the comma in the password would stop the password from being listed if it somehow was leaked, but it at least has a slightly higher chance of breaking some lists compared to some other character options. It's more important to have a long password, which I recommend being at least 16 characters, since it's a lot harder for password guessing software to guess a password that is that long. Using a passphrase instead of a password could help you get to that character length. Now, back to multi-factor authentication methods. You may have an option of getting a text message with a code to verify you are who you say you are, coupled with a password. I'll qualify you having the phone number and phone to receive the text message on as something you have, and the password as something you know. However, depending on the system you're using, text messages may not be encrypted, and something called a SIM swap fraud is possible, so there could be a couple of potential issues with this. A SIM swap fraud is basically where a bad hacker makes their SIM card work with your phone number. This could happen, for example, by someone cloning your voice or just acting as if that person is you in order to convince the person at your phone carrier that the bad hacker's phone is yours. If you have the option to use other methods of multi-factor authentication that I've mentioned in this video, I'll recommend those. But using text messaging as a form of multi-factor authentication is, in my opinion, so much better than not doing multi-factor authentication at all. The last method of multi-factor authentication that I'll mention is another one of the most important things that I want you to adopt. Please buy USB keys as a way to do multi-factor authentication. Pairing a USB key with a password manager can be a good way to help you stay safer online. So, if you're using a USB key, which is something you have if you buy one, paired with something you in spirit know like a password saved by a password manager, this is a pretty good combination in my opinion. There was a big tech company that switched to using USB keys as a requirement within the company, and the number of successful email scams went down. Even if a bad hacker has a password, it's a lot harder for a bad hacker that's far away to have your USB key. There are other brands, but I like the brand YubiKey, which I'm not affiliated with. If you buy YubiKeys, I recommend buying 2 or 3 in case you lose one or something happens to one of the keys. It's important to have a backup USB key. I recommend buying one of the YubiKeys that are larger since those can be harder to lose and easier to take out. I personally don't recommend the YubiKey with the fingerprint scanner on it since I personally had trouble getting it to work and register my fingerprint when I tried it. I can imagine someone who isn't as well versed in tech things getting more annoyed than I was trying to figure out how to use that. Also, there's a smaller version of the YubiKey, but in my opinion, that can be easier to lose. And also, I have so much trouble taking it out of my Mac Studio that I have to use pliers to take it out. This is just my personal recommendation based on my experience. I highly recommend that you buy USB keys and learn how to use these. If you've picked up nothing else from this entire course, learning about password managers and USB keys I think are a couple of the most important things you can learn about from this course. Please use these, but make sure to buy multiple USB keys and keep the backups safe, possibly in a fireproof container or in a safety deposit box just in case. There's a relatively new method of logging into things that I hope will catch on, and I figured I'd mention it here. Maybe you can peer pressure the company you work for to adopt this, if you feel it's appropriate. You know how annoying it can be to have to change passwords and type those in? Well, there's a system called a passkey system, which, long story short, is a passwordless way to log in. You could put in your email address, which is something you know, and then use something like a USB key, which is something you have if you own a USB key, and use that to log in without using a password. There are a lot of cybersecurity people who are excited about passkey systems and hope that passwordless systems grow in popularity due to the combination of security and ease of use those systems can provide. There are other methods for multi-factor authentication, but I want to focus on ones that may be more applicable to what I feel is the average person's everyday life. I think you'll have enough to springboard from based on this video, and I hope that you'll be adopting multi-factor authentication, sometimes referred to as two-factor authentication, when you're logging in online.